why it's impossible that NASA proved the moon landing.
Across the shifting crust of the Earth, beneath mountains ground to dust and oceans that have come and gone like breaths in geological time, there exist epochs so ancient that even imagination struggles to hold them. Epochs in which entire landscapes rose and perished long before the first dinosaur carved its track into soft mud. Epochs in which life may have reached forms of complexity and intelligence that left no surviving monument, no artifact durable enough to escape the relentless dissolution of deep time. When we confront these forgotten immensities, we are compelled to ask a far more profound question about human certainty itself. For if Earth has erased worlds older than memory, how can we expect any narrative from our own age, even the triumph of stepping onto the moon, to remain forever immune to reinterpretation? This is not a challenge to the historic reality of Apollo, nor an invitation to dismiss the overwhelming scientific evidence of humanity's lunar achievement. Instead, it is an inquiry into the nature of proof across eras in which continents are swallowed, fossils are rearranged by pressure and heat, and the geological record behaves less like a history book and more like a palimpsest with most of its pages scraped clean. In such a universe, the pursuit of absolute proof becomes a philosophical paradox. The moon landing, therefore, becomes not an event in doubt, but a lens through which we examine our assumptions about permanence in a world that forgets even its greatest epochs. Imagine the camera descending slowly across an eroded cliff face, each sediment layer holding the ghost of a vanished era. The narration recites what the rocks cannot, that Earth is not merely old, but actively devours its own past. What could have existed in the Silurians' shallow seas? What intelligence might have flourished during the Carboniferous, when oxygen saturated the air and forests towered like green cathedrals? Could a civilization have formed, adapted to the climates of its time, and disappeared so thoroughly that even its ashes were transformed into nothing more than minerals? This is not speculation for spectacle. It is a reminder that geological processes remove more than they preserve, and that the deeper we travel into Earth's prehistory, the less evidence remains of anything that might have lived, discovered, or built. We stand on a planet where the past is not stored but continuously overwritten, and where the absence of evidence is not necessarily the evidence of absence. Here, a quiet skepticism takes root. If entire civilizations could disappear without trace across hundreds of millions of years, what does it mean to claim that any modern event possesses eternal, irrefutable proof? Not because the event is false, but because permanence itself is an illusion. The moon, untouched by wind or water, preserves human footprints with perfect indifference. Earth, by contrast, preserves almost nothing. When we compare these two worlds, the philosophical tension becomes clear. On the moon, a record may last unbroken for millennia. On Earth, our histories crumble faster than they can be written. Thus, the moon landing, so meticulously documented and technologically verified, becomes a paradox. A moment intended to endure forever, set against a planet that erases everything. Our desire for definitive proof collides with the natural law that nothing on Earth remains definitive. This is the true narrative tension, a reinterpretative lens through which skepticism does not negate truth, but interrogates the limits of human certainty. And as we journey deeper into this documentary, we will follow a single unifying question. How can we demand absolute certainty for a modern event when Earth's own prehistory hides secrets vast enough to question the completeness of any timeline? The camera draws back from the cliff face and reveals a world shaped not by centuries but by immensities of time, measured in cycles of destruction and renewal. To understand why absolute proof becomes a fragile concept, we must begin not with the moon, but with the Earth itself, a planet that refuses to preserve its own story. The surface beneath our feet is not an archive. It is a battlefield of tectonic forces, erosion, subduction, volcanic creation, and chemical transformation. Every continent is built of ruins layered upon ruins, each stratum a partial sentence in a book whose earlier chapters have been torn away. Scientists call this the geological record, but to the untrained eye it is a mosaic of scattered fragments, the overwhelming majority of Earth's past already lost to metamorphosis and erosion. Fossils represent a tiny sample of all that has lived. Artifacts from human civilizations barely survive a few thousand years without careful protection. Structures carved in stone collapse. Metal oxidizes. Organic materials vanish. But what of epochs measured not in millennia or millions, but in hundreds of millions of years? Those eras lie beyond the reach of preservation. Their landscapes were folded back into the mantle. Their oceans changed shape. Their mountains rose and fell like tides of rock. This relentless recycling forces us to accept a humbling truth. If an ancient civilization had existed before the dinosaurs, its traces would be nearly impossible to detect today. Even a technologically advanced species would leave behind little that could endure the crush of geological time. Their cities might become minerals within metamorphic rock. Their tools might be ground to dust. Their structures might dissolve in chemical reactions far older than the continents we know. We are left to search for anomalies, scattered hints that challenge conventional timelines, yet no single fragment can speak for the vastness of lost worlds. Against this backdrop of erasure, the idea of definitive proof becomes strangely tenuous. Our modern demand for absolute certainty clashes with the planet's own refusal to preserve its history. Earth does not keep records, it devours them. This raises the philosophical paradox at the heart of our exploration. If the planet has erased even the possibility of reconstructing entire civilizations, how can we imagine that our current events, no matter how well documented, could escape the same fate? Imagine a hypothetical species thriving in the Carboniferous swamps. Imagine another navigating the shallow seas of the Devonian. Imagine their knowledge, tools, languages, and discoveries entirely obliterated by time. Their stories no longer exist as narratives but as silence, a silence so complete that we must rely on imagination and inference to fill the void. This emptiness becomes a field on which reinterpretative theories take shape, not because they rewrite verified history, but because they acknowledge the incompleteness of the geological archive. The camera moves across fossil beds, showing perfect impressions of leaves, yet no trace of the forests they belong to. It glides past exposed tectonic faults, where ancient seabeds now stand thousands of meters above sea level. It lingers on igneous cliffs that once flowed as molten rivers. Each image reinforces the same undeniable truth. The Earth is dynamic, not static. Memory is not its function, and absence is not the same as simplicity. In such a world, certainty is not a natural condition. Certainty is a human desire imposed upon a planet that does not share it. This realization reframes our understanding of the moon landing as a philosophical narrative. The event is historically sound, yet the framework through which we assign permanence to it is built upon the illusion that Earth itself supports permanence. By exploring the possibility of civilizations forgotten long before the dinosaurs, we confront a powerful idea. If deep time has rendered unimaginable chapters of Earth's history unknowable, then the notion of irrefutable proof becomes a construct of the present, not a guarantee for the future. This chapter closes with a quiet tension. Earth has erased so much that it becomes the perfect teacher of skepticism. Not skepticism that denies reality, but skepticism that questions human expectations of permanence. The viewer is left with a lingering thought. If we cannot recover the stories buried beneath continents, how confidently can we speak of any event surviving the scrutiny of future ages? The camera rises from the fractured landscapes of Earth and drifts outward, as if attempting to escape the constraints of geology itself. Yet even from this distance, the planet's defining characteristic remains visible. Nothing upon its surface is eternal. Every mountain, every ocean trench, every fossil bed is a temporary expression of processes far older than biology. This movement from Earth's physical erasure to the philosophical consequences of that erasure marks a shift in our investigation. If Chapter 1 revealed how history dissolves, Chapter 2 examines what this dissolution means for the very concept of proof. In human culture, proof is treated as a final destination. It is the moment when uncertainty fades and truth becomes permanent. But permanence is not a quality granted by the universe. It is a construct built by a species trying to navigate its own limited lifespan within a world that predates it by billions of years. Evidence, therefore, is not an objective monument, but a fragile intersection of artifacts, memory, interpretation, and context. Change any variable, and the meaning of proof shifts dramatically. Consider ancient fossils. When first discovered, they were interpreted through mythological frameworks. Later, they were categorized as curiosities. Only with the emergence of paleontology did they become the backbone of evolutionary theory. The bones did not change. The context did. Interpretation forged truth from fragments. This pattern repeats across every historical discipline. What humanity calls proof is often the alignment of consensus, perspective, and available material, rather than an immutable certainty rising above time. Now imagine extending this pattern across millions of years. Imagine future beings examining our era with incomplete records, fragmented archives, and the same interpretive instincts that guide us today. Our digital signals may not survive. Our cities may become geological noise. Our satellites will fall from orbit. The film footage that now seems inseparable from the truth of the moon landing could degrade into static or be misinterpreted through future knowledge systems. In this hypothetical scenario, the event itself remains real, yet the capacity for future civilizations to reconstruct it with absolute clarity becomes uncertain. This is the ceiling of evidence, a conceptual threshold beyond which proof cannot be guaranteed, no matter how rigorous, abundant, or technologically sophisticated it seems in the present. The ceiling does not negate truth, it limits permanence. What appears definitive within one era becomes ambiguous within another. Geological time does not merely erase artifacts, it erodes contexts, turning certainties into puzzles. The camera now moves across ancient riverbeds preserved in stone, their flowing forms frozen by mineral transformation. These patterns are unmistakable in their clarity, yet they tell us only that water once flowed. They cannot tell us who walked beside those rivers, what minds contemplated their turbulence, or whether intelligence shaped the landscape in ways now unrecoverable. The ceiling of evidence restricts our understanding not because the truth is absent, but because the mechanisms of preservation are selective, biased, and incomplete. This brings us to a philosophical tension central to reinterpretative theories. When we approach the moon landing as a narrative lens, we are not claiming that its reality is uncertain. We are recognizing that certainty has limits imposed by time. The Apollo missions exist within an unusually fragile framework. A technological age whose records are heavily dependent on media formats vulnerable to decay, digital loss, and future reinterpretation. It is not the event itself that is questioned, but the assumption that its proof can remain eternally immune to the distortions of time. The contrast with prehistoric civilizations becomes sharper here. If advanced beings thrived before the dinosaurs, their achievements were swallowed by the planet long before humans evolved. Their inventions, discoveries, and histories could not escape the ceiling of evidence. In this light, skepticism becomes a tool not for denial, but for humility. It acknowledges that even our own greatest triumphs are subject to the same cosmic indifference that erased the stories of possible worlds predating us. The chapter closes with an unsettling realization. Humanity desires proof that endures forever, yet we inhabit a dynamic planet that refuses to honor such desires. The ceiling of evidence is not a flaw in human reasoning. It is a natural law, a boundary etched by time itself. To question the permanence of lunar proof is to recognize how all civilizations, past and present, are shaped not only by what they achieve, but by what the Earth allows to survive. The camera ascends beyond Earth's atmosphere and enters the silent expanse of space, where the moon hangs not as a distant object, but as an ancient witness. Its surface is a vast archive of impacts, a realm untouched by wind or rain, where every footprint, every disturbance, every trace of presence can remain preserved for millions of years. This frozen stillness stands in stark contrast to the Earth we have just explored, a world that erases history as quickly as it produces it. And it is within this contrast that the next layer of our inquiry takes shape. The moon is, in many ways, the ideal symbol of human longing for permanence. It reflects sunlight with the same silver calm today as it did before life began on Earth. It has watched the rise and fall of continents, the emergence of multicellular life, the the flourishing of entire prehistoric ecosystems, and the extinction of unimaginable lineages. If civilizations did exist before the dinosaurs, the moon observed them all without expression, recording nothing, yet witnessing everything. Its surface holds the potential for memory, but its silence denies interpretation. This duality becomes the heart of the lunar enigma. As the camera glides across the moon's barren plains, the narration introduces the paradox at the center of this chapter. Humanity's greatest attempt to leave a permanent mark was aimed at a celestial body that remembers perfectly, yet communicates nothing. The Apollo missions placed instruments, flags, and footprints upon a surface incapable of decay. But while the traces may survive, the meaning attached to them does not. Meaning belongs to Earth, a planet where narratives are fragile, where records are perishable, and where interpretation shifts with each generation. This tension between permanence and interpretation reveals why the moon landing functions so powerfully as a philosophical device. In the present era, humanity possesses extensive documentation, scientific data, physical samples, and technological records validating the mission. But the deeper question is not whether the event occurred. The deeper question is whether the concept of definitive lunar proof can withstand the erosion of context across the unimaginable spans of time that have already erased entire civilizations. The moon itself preserves physical traces, yet the interpretive frameworks on Earth, those required to understand or trust those traces, remain vulnerable. Here, the narrative draws a parallel with hypothetical prehistoric civilizations. If an ancient species had once achieved a celestial milestone of its own, the markers of that triumph could still exist somewhere in the solar system. But without the cultural memory or preserved context to interpret them, such remnants would appear as meaningless anomalies. The lunar enigma invites us to imagine that the same fate could eventually befall our own achievements. We leave perfect footprints on a surface unwilling to erase them, but Earth may someday lose the ability to explain them. The camera shifts to a slow rotation around the moon's south pole, where shadows stretch forever into unlit craters. These darkened regions symbolize the unknown, places where ice may persist and where ancient impacts hide secrets older than any terrestrial record. If the moon preserves every epoch, then it also preserves mysteries we have not yet uncovered. This imagery creates a bridge to the central philosophical dilemma. When we speak of proof, we speak of coherence, a thread connecting an event to the present. But the moon, in its neutrality, keeps the fragments while dissolving the thread. The chapter intensifies this paradox. The more perfectly the moon preserves the physical traces of Apollo, the more starkly it contrasts with Earth's inability to preserve the context needed to interpret them indefinitely. In future ages, humanity's lunar artifacts might be discovered by beings who do not share our assumptions, our technological history, or our cultural frameworks. They may find the footprints, instruments, or descent stages, yet interpret them in ways that diverge radically from the historical truth. Without context, even perfect preservation drifts into ambiguity. This chapter closes with the haunting idea that the moon landing is a triumph precisely because it attempts to escape the impermanence of Earth. But proof, meaning, and memory remain bound to a planet that forgets. The lunar enigma reveals not the impossibility of the event, but the impossibility of anchoring any human truth permanently against the tides of geological and cosmic time. The lens now descends from the airless serenity of the moon back toward the ancient Earth, but not to the familiar world of recorded history. Instead, it enters epochs so remote that they evade even the deepest instincts of imagination. To explore the impossibility of definitive proof in our own time, we must confront the even greater impossibility of retrieving proof from ages erased long before the dawn of dinosaurs. In this chapter, we widen the scope of our inquiry, moving from the moon's preserved stillness into Earth's abyss of forgotten worlds, where traces of life and intelligence may have risen, transformed, and vanished without leaving a single unbroken artifact. The camera glides across carboniferous forests recreated from fossil evidence, towering ferns stretching skyward in humid light. Yet the ground beneath them represents a discontinuity. These landscapes are not merely old, they are chapters from a time when Earth's ecosystems were alien, its atmosphere hyper-oxygenated, its planetary rhythms unrecognizable to any creature living today. If complex societies had emerged then, would we expect to find the remnants? Or would their structures have been swallowed by the very geological forces we examined in previous chapters? Consider the Silurian reefs, the Devonian river deltas, the Cambrian seabeds, where early life exploded into complexity. Each of these eras spans millions of years, an expanse so vast that the entire timeline of human civilization forms only a single grain of sand upon their shore. The deeper we look, the more we confront a haunting asymmetry. Fossilization requires rare conditions. Preservation demands perfect stillness, and even then, the record captures only a fraction of a fraction. Most organisms are lost. Most events are obliterated. Most environments vanish without leaving a single trace. Archaeology, paleontology, and geology provide extraordinary insights, but they also reveal an enormous shadow of absence. This absence is not emptiness. It is possibility. It is the space in which reinterpretative theories take shape, drawing on scientific limitations and geological silence to ask what might have existed in eras beyond the scale of human certainty. The camera now pans across metamorphic rock formations, their shifting mineral bands twisted under unimaginable pressures. These rocks conceal histories we cannot access. Any technological or architectural presence older than 400 million years would have been transformed into crystalline structures. Such metamorphosis eliminates material evidence, but cannot eliminate the philosophical implications. If Earth has the capacity to erase even signs of intelligence, then absolute proof becomes unattainable for any civilization, including our own. It is here that skepticism becomes a lens through which to explore the limitations of human knowledge. Not skepticism as denial, but skepticism as recognition of scale. If prehistoric civilizations before the dinosaurs had achieved feats rivaling or surpassing our own, their memory could not survive the cycles of continental drift and subduction. Their stories would perish in Earth's mantle, their technologies would decompose in mineral reactions. Their monuments would crumble, their art dissolve, their achievements collapse into fragments so reworked by time that even our most advanced tools would fail to recognize them. The transition from this ancient unknown to the modern lunar narrative forms the core tension of the documentary. When we analyze the moon landing through this speculative lens, we do not question the fact of the event. Instead, we examine the fragility of the frameworks on which its proof relies. If we cannot retrieve the histories of worlds that may have existed for millions of years, then the expectation that any modern achievement could remain eternally self-evident becomes unrealistic. The point is not to diminish Apollo, but to contextualize it within a universe that dissolves history without hesitation. The camera moves into a sequence showing erosion carving away ancient cliffs, rivers exposing fossils, and volcanic flows sealing layers beneath basalt. These transitions underscore the relentless processes that shaped and reshaped Earth long before mammals, reptiles, or even vertebrates existed. In this setting, prehistoric civilizations before the dinosaurs shift from speculative fiction into philosophical illustration. They represent the scale at which certainty fails. They embody the idea that truth may be real yet inaccessible. They teach us that absence of evidence is not a contradiction, but an inevitable consequence of time. This chapter ends with a quiet provocation. If we live on a planet that has erased entire possible worlds, how can any civilization, including ours, presume that its greatest achievements will remain intelligible to future ages? The moon landing stands as a symbol of human aspiration, but also of our vulnerability to time, context, and reinterpretation. A question lingers as the screen fades. If Earth itself remembers nothing permanently, then what does it truly mean to search for a definitive proof of anything? The camera moves fluidly from Earth's prehistoric silence into a twilight space between imagination and analysis, where timelines blur and knowledge becomes a field of shifting interpretations. Here, the documentary enters its central conceptual device, the parallel timeline, a framework not meant to rewrite history, but to reveal how interpretations themselves evolve when confronted with the impossibility of reconstructing deep time. In this landscape, the moon landing becomes more than an event. It becomes a philosophical inflection point, a story whose meaning depends entirely on the era that interprets it. The parallel timeline begins with a simple premise. Every civilization perceives its own age as the culmination of all previous epochs. Its myths become foundations, its discoveries become inevitabilities, and its achievements become milestones of an unbroken ascent. But Earth's geological record contradicts this comforting narrative. The deeper we examine the strata beneath our feet, the more we encounter discontinuities, missing layers, compression gaps, entire epochs that compress millions of years into a thin seam of stone. These absences form the skeleton of the alternate interpretative lens we now construct. A timeline not of events, but of what could have existed within these voids. The camera drifts across the supercontinents of the ancient past. Rodinia, Pannotia, Gondwana. Each of these landmasses hosted environments radically different from anything alive today. Forests towered where deserts now sprawl. Shallow seas covered what would become mountains. Glacial expanses migrated across the equator. Within this constantly rearranging map, the parallel timeline imagines the possibilities that geology has rendered invisible. What might an intelligent species have become had it evolved in the Devonian shallows or the warm Carboniferous swamps? How might its culture interpret celestial bodies? How might it record, reinterpret, or mythologize its own discoveries? This speculative exercise does not claim such civilizations existed. Rather, it demonstrates how fragile our own narratives become when set against the planet's capacity for erasure. The parallel timeline is a mirror. It reveals how our understanding of truth depends not on the event, but on the continuity of interpretation. In this framework, the moon landing becomes a symbol of our era's attempt to inscribe meaning onto the cosmos, while acknowledging that future ages may encounter the remnants of Apollo without the cultural context to fully decipher them. The camera now transitions into a visual meditation. The surface of the moon juxtaposed with deep-sea basalt formations, lunar dust alongside banded metamorphic rock. The lunar module's descent stage superimposed against the imagined ruins of a prehistoric reef city erased long before dinosaurs walked the Earth. These overlapping images construct the philosophical tension of the chapter. If traces can exist without explanation, then explanation itself becomes fragile. Here, we introduce a psychological shift. The viewer begins to see the moon landing not as a question of authenticity, but as an example of how history becomes vulnerable to reinterpretation once its explanatory framework dissolves. A civilization emerging millions of years after humanity might find lunar artifacts, but lack the accompanying context. Technological evolution, cultural significance, audiovisual archives. They may reconstruct a story from fragments, or they may invent entirely new narratives, just as we reinterpret the fossil record of ancient Earth. This realization intensifies the skeptical perspective without descending into denial. The skepticism here is epistemological, not conspiratorial. It asserts that if geological time devours history, then no civilization can guarantee permanent clarity about its achievements. The moon landing is real, but the permanence of its proof is limited by the same forces that erased prehistoric worlds. As the chapter deepens, the camera passes through cracks in ancient stone, where mineral veins glow faintly under filtered sunlight. Each vein is a reminder that interpretation is selective. It highlights what time has chosen to preserve, not what time has eliminated. This selective survival becomes the narrative bridge to the next chapter, where we will confront the fragility of collective memory itself. A brief pause invites reflection, followed by a concise invitation. Like and subscribe to help this journey continue into the depths of forgotten worlds and the uncertainties that define them. The chapter ends with an emerging tension. If prehistoric civilizations could leave no definitive trace, and if lunar proof is subject to future reinterpretation, then we stand between two silences: the forgotten past and the unknowable future. Our only guide is the present moment, fragile and fleeting, in which meaning still endures. The camera opens on a landscape of ruins, but not human ones. Instead, we see petrified forests frozen in mineral embrace, the impressions of ancient organisms flattened into stone by ages of pressure. These remnants are not monuments left intentionally, they are accidents of preservation, And in these accidents, we confront the quiet truth that memory, whether biological, cultural, or geological, is not a stable force. It is always eroding, always rearranging, always vulnerable to the reinterpretations of the future. This chapter turns inward, shifting from Earth's physical transformations to the transformations that occur within collective consciousness. Human societies do not remember history as it was. They remember history as they believe it should be. Narratives adapt to the needs of their eras. Records are curated, revised, and often misunderstood. Even well-documented events undergo changes as generations reinterpret them through new lenses. Memory, therefore, behaves more like sediment than crystal. It settles unevenly, shaped by pressures both visible and invisible. The camera glides over ancient seabeds uplifted into mountains, their once horizontal layers now twisted by tectonic movements. This visual metaphor underscores the chapter's theme, that memory does not preserve straight lines. It folds, fractures, and reforms. The moon landing, widely recorded and technologically validated, seems immune to such distortions. Yet history shows that even the clearest events can shift in collective understanding when the frameworks that support their interpretation begin to crumble. To explore this fragility, we revisit prehistoric ages older than the dinosaurs. If civilizations existed in these unfathomable periods, their memory was not merely lost, it was obliterated. No oral traditions persisted through the crushing silence of extinction events. No written documents survived the subduction of continents. No monuments resisted metamorphic obliteration. Intelligence itself could have risen and vanished without leaving a coherent story behind. In such a scenario, memory is not merely fragile, it is impossible. Now the camera moves through modern archives, shelves of documents, reels of film, digital servers humming in darkened rooms. These repositories feel secure, yet the viewer begins to sense their vulnerability. Paper burns, tape degrades, digital formats become obsolete. Even the languages through which we describe events evolve. A future civilization may inherit fragments but struggle to decode them, just as we struggle to decode the fossil record, ancient scripts, or anomalies embedded in rock. Memory requires continuity, but Earth's history is defined by interruptions. This leads us to a critical question. If human memory is fragile and geological memory is selective, then where does certainty reside? The viewer is drawn back to the thematic core. The paradox of definitive proof for the moon landing is not about the event's authenticity, but about the transience of the interpretive frameworks that allow future beings to understand it. Proof is not just evidence. Proof is the ability to contextualize evidence. Without context, even the most unambiguous artifact can become a mystery. The camera drifts across lunar images again, but this time through the imagined perspective of a future intelligence. They might see the descent stage of an Apollo lander and recognize it as machinery, or they might interpret it as an object of ritual significance. Or perhaps they will see only debris, stripped of meaning by the passage of time. On Earth, reinterpretation is inevitable because memory is a dynamic process. It adapts, shrinks, distorts, and sometimes disappears entirely. This fragility of memory resonates with prehistoric civilizations before the dinosaurs. If any such society once stood upon this world, its memory has collapsed so thoroughly that we are left only with speculation. In this light, skepticism becomes more than an intellectual stance. It becomes a recognition of scale and vulnerability. Our achievements are monumental in the present, yet fragile when measured against the churn of geological time. The camera closes on a single fossilized footprint preserved in rock. It is the last trace of a creature whose life we cannot reconstruct. We know nothing of its behaviors, its struggles, its desires. It is a perfect symbol of our limitations. A footprint survives, yet the memory of the walker is gone. So too, the artifacts of human exploration may endure on the moon long after the capacity to interpret them fades. This chapter ends by bridging toward the coming narrative turn. If memory is fragile, then what hope does certainty possess? We step now into the realm where truth itself confronts the limits imposed by time. The camera transitions from the solitary fossilized footprint to a panoramic sweep across Earth's shifting landscapes, moving through deserts sculpted by wind, glaciers grinding mountains into powder, and coastlines advancing and retreating over eons. These images prepare the mind for a deeper confrontation with the central paradox of this documentary: the impossibility not of the moon landing, but of preserving any human truth as eternally, universally provable. Here, the narrative shifts from the fragility of memory to the fundamental limitations of certainty itself. Proof, in the scientific sense, is robust. It stands on data, replication, and consensus. The moon landing, as an event, is supported by independent tracking systems, physical samples, photographs, engineering records, eyewitness accounts, telemetry, and the later confirmation of lunar artifacts through high-resolution orbital imaging. Within the scale of human history, this body of evidence is overwhelming. Yet the philosophical dilemma emerges when we place this event against the vast canvas of deep time. The issue is not whether the event happened. The issue is whether any form of proof can remain immune to reinterpretation as millennia stretch toward geological scales. The camera now glides along the boundaries of tectonic plates, where molten rock churns beneath the crust, consuming old surfaces and generating new ones. This perpetual recycling is more than a geological process. It is a metaphor for the reworking of truth across ages. Just as continents are remade, stories are reshaped. As Earth transforms, so too does interpretation. What appears definitive within one era begins to fracture under the pressures of cultural shifts, lost context, and the eventual decay of records. In this light, the impossibility of absolute proof becomes evident. Human knowledge is built on layers of interpretation, each dependent on cultural continuity and the preservation of explanatory frameworks. But these frameworks are not eternal. If a future civilization arises after the collapse or transformation of human society, its scholars may encounter traces of our achievements without the interpretive lineage necessary to understand them. They might find lunar modules resting silently on the moon's surface, yet lack the technological history that links them to a species capable of reaching space. They may see the footprints, but not the purpose. They may accept the artifacts, reinterpret them, or dismiss them entirely depending on their worldview. The camera shifts to an imagined future archaeological expedition, its perspective speculative but grounded in the logic of reinterpretation. We see researchers examining fragments of data storage devices preserved by chance rather than intention. They reconstruct partial visuals of astronaut footage but cannot decipher the context. Their understanding, built upon fragmentary evidence, mirrors our own attempts to piece together the stories of prehistoric Earth. In this mirrored structure, the viewer confronts the possibility that all civilizations, no matter how advanced, become subject to the same uncertainties. This parallel deepens when we return to prehistoric civilizations before dinosaurs. If such societies existed, their truths were swallowed by time's machinery. Their discoveries left no cohesive imprint. Their narratives collapsed into geological noise. If they achieved remarkable feats, their proof was annihilated by processes indifferent to intelligence or culture. This is not a claim of their existence, but a demonstration of how time deforms even the most concrete realities. In a world that forgets, proof cannot remain eternal. The camera now dwells on the moon's surface once more, contrasting human footprints, preserved in perfect stillness, with the dynamic volatility of Earth. The moon keeps evidence, but it does not keep meaning. Meaning lives on Earth, a planet that allows nothing to remain unchanged. This juxtaposition emphasizes the philosophical core of the chapter. Proof is never merely physical. It requires interpretation. Without context, even perfect evidence can become ambiguous. Thus, the impossibility of definitive lunar proof is not a critique of Apollo. It is a recognition of the limits inherent in all human attempts to anchor truth against the currents of time. Earth's forgotten epochs reveal that certainty is temporary, interpretation is fluid, and memory is vulnerable. In this sense, the moon landing becomes a symbol of humanity's desire to transcend impermanence, yet it remains bound to a universe that erases, transforms, and reinterprets all things. The chapter closes with a deepening tension. If proof itself is transient, then humanity's greatest triumphs are not protected by evidence alone. They depend on the continuity of interpretation, a chain easily broken by time. And so the question remains: How do we seek certainty on a planet that forgets? The camera opens on a slow downward drift through clouds, descending toward an Earth unrecognizable to modern eyes. Volcanic plateaus stretch beyond the horizon. Primeval oceans churn against basalt cliffs. Forests pulse with life forms that have no descendants. The narration enters with a measured, reflective gravity, guiding the viewer into the symbolic heart of the documentary. Here we examine how prehistoric civilizations, if they existed before the age of dinosaurs, offer insight into the human struggle to anchor truth in a universe that continuously resets its histories. This chapter is not about proving ancient civilizations, but about using their hypothetical existence to illuminate the broader paradox, the tension between human certainty and geological indifference. As the camera sweeps across this alien Earth, the viewer senses a strange familiarity. These are the landscapes from which life emerged, the crucibles in which complexity evolved, the forgotten theaters where great dramas may have unfolded long before mammals, reptiles, or even vertebrates walked the land. Whether or not intelligence ever flourished in these epochs is secondary to the realization that, if it did, its entire narrative has been absorbed into rock. To imagine such civilizations is to strain against the limits of human inference, for Earth offers us only fragments, none of which form a clear picture. Yet this absence becomes a powerful teacher. It demonstrates that truth can exist independently of its detectability. A civilization might rise, build, discover, collapse, and vanish, leaving behind no coherent trace. Our inability to reconstruct its history would not negate its existence. Instead, it would reveal the constraints of our epistemological reach. This realization becomes a reflective mirror, allowing us to view our own era, including its triumphs such as the moon landing, through the lens of fragile continuity rather than absolute permanence. The camera shifts to deep ocean trenches, where hydrothermal vents glow like submerged cities, their mineral towers rising from the abyssal plain. These images evoke the possibility that life may have taken complex forms in environments we still scarcely understand. If intelligence evolved in such realms, its artifacts might never have been accessible to future species. Pressure, heat, and tectonic recycling would erase all traces. The lunar narrative, in contrast, exists in an environment of extraordinary preservation. Yet even this preservation cannot guarantee indefinite interpretability. This is the essence of the Great Return. It is not the return of lost civilizations, but the return of an idea, that human certainty is always provisional, that we occupy a fleeting moment within cycles far larger than our recorded history, and that the desire for definitive proof, whether of ancient events or modern achievements, collides with the fundamental truth that the Earth is not a stable archive. It is a system of transformation and renewal, a planet that refuses to preserve even its most extraordinary stories. The camera now moves across a hypothetical reconstruction of a pre-dinosaur city, illuminated not as fact, but as a metaphor for interpretive humility. Its structures shimmer, dissolving intermittently into surrounding rock formations, as if slipping between existence and erasure. This imagery underscores the chapter's central point. Evidence is not truth, and lack of evidence is not non-existence. What survives is arbitrary. What is lost may be immeasurable. The moon landing becomes a symbolic counterpoint to these vanished worlds, representing humanity's attempt to place a permanent mark upon a universe that offers no guarantees. As we explore this philosophy, we encounter a deeper truth about reinterpretative theories. They do not necessarily claim alternative histories. Rather, they challenge the human assumption that the histories we construct are complete. They invite us to acknowledge how much we do not know and how fragile our framework for understanding reality truly is. The moon landing is not diminished by this lens. In fact, its significance grows. It becomes a testament to humanity's effort to defy impermanence, even though impermanence ultimately defines us. The camera returns to the moon itself, hovering above footprints etched in dust older than nearly all terrestrial fossils. These marks are pristine, untouched by erosion or wind, yet surrounded by a cosmos indifferent to their meaning. Back on Earth, interpretations remain delicate, vulnerable to the same forces that erased prehistoric epochs. The Great Return thus links the ancient and the modern, revealing that every civilization, no matter how advanced, must confront the same cosmic truth. Time erodes certainty faster than it erases stone. The chapter moves toward its closing image, a vast expanse of ocean framed by the silhouettes of primordial mountains. The narration reflects on our place within this immensity. If prehistoric civilizations existed, they have vanished into silence. If our own civilization endures or collapses, its memory will be shaped by forces beyond our control. The moon landing, like all achievements, is real, yet the permanence of its meaning is not guaranteed. And before we continue, a brief invitation. Like and subscribe to support the continuation of this deep exploration into forgotten eras and the mysteries that challenge human certainty. The chapter ends with a quiet tension, preparing the viewer for the penultimate descent into the boundaries between knowledge and the unknown. The camera lifts from primordial seas into a dim horizon where the Earth's rotation slows, not in speed but in perception. Here, the narration enters a region suspended between what can be known and what forever escapes comprehension. This is the boundary of knowing, a conceptual threshold where science, philosophy, and geological reality converge. It is where human certainty fractures, not because of contradiction, but because of scale. The closer we draw to this boundary, the more clearly we see how the expectations we place upon proof conflict with the mechanisms of a universe indifferent to preservation. The camera glides across continental shelves that have risen and fallen countless times. Once they were submerged worlds teeming with life. Now they form mountain ranges or desert plains. These transformations illuminate a paradox. The greater the span of time, the more difficult it becomes to distinguish truth from absence. Our understanding of Earth's prehistory is built upon scattered fossils, mineral anomalies, and isolated impressions. Yet these fragments, incomplete as they are, form the backbone of our scientific narratives. They tell us what lived, what died, and how ecosystems evolved. But they cannot tell us everything. They cannot reveal what evidence was lost, what worlds vanished without trace, or what civilizations might have existed within the blank zones of geological silence. This boundary becomes the psychological bridge to the moon landing narrative. Because when we confront the erasure embedded in Earth's history, we confront the limits of permanence. Apollo is documented, verified, and supported by a multitude of independent sources. But this certainty belongs to our era. It depends on technology still intact, institutions still functioning, knowledge systems still continuous. The very idea of definitive proof assumes that these systems will endure unchanged, yet humanity's own recorded history shows that continuity is always fragile. Libraries burn, archives decay, technologies become unusable, languages vanish. When institutions fall, so do the interpretive frameworks that give evidence its meaning. The camera moves into deep caves where layers of calcite have sealed ancient chambers, creating natural vaults of geological time. These formations remind us that to understand the past, we must often rely on chance, on what time chose to protect rather than what it erased. Our species has existed for only a heartbeat compared to the age of the Earth, and yet in that brief moment, we have created narratives of extraordinary complexity. But the boundary of knowing is a reminder that these narratives are transient. Even unassailable truths can be buried beneath layers of reinterpretation once the structures that support them collapse. Now the camera rises toward the night sky where the moon hovers, cold and radiant. The narration guides the viewer into a contemplative contrast. On the moon, artifacts remain. Their forms will persist, untouched by erosion, for millennia. But meaning does not reside in forms. Meaning resides in minds. And minds are bound to Earth's fragile continuum of culture. If that continuum breaks, the artifacts become curiosities, stripped of the context that makes them proofs. The viewer begins to understand the paradox. Certainty is not secured by evidence alone, but by the continuity of interpretation across time. This insight deepens when we recall prehistoric civilizations before the dinosaurs. Whether they existed is not the claim. What matters is the realization that, if they had existed, their truths could not survive. Their knowledge, achievements, and narratives would have been obliterated by tectonic churn and geological metamorphosis. This hypothetical civilization becomes the philosophical cautionary tale through which we view ourselves. If deep time can erase an entire world, then the expectation that any event, however monumental, can maintain eternal interpretive clarity becomes untenable. The camera drifts to an image of an ancient fault line, a break in the crust symbolizing the fracture between certainty and ambiguity. The narration speaks with calm authority. The boundary of knowing is not a place where truth dissolves, it is where human expectations dissolve. It reveals that our demand for conclusive, everlasting proof is a projection of our temporal anxieties, not a condition that the universe is obligated to satisfy. This chapter ends as the camera fades into shadow. Ahead lies the final descent, where all threads converge: proof, memory, deep time, lost civilizations, and the paradox that binds them. The viewer prepares to enter the last chapter, where the documentary will confront its deepest philosophical question. The camera opens on a quiet horizon, a line of fading amber light stretching across an ancient landscape. It is neither modern nor recognizable. It could belong to the Cambrian, the Devonian, or a forgotten epoch erased so deeply that only the Earth itself remembers its existence. The narration enters with steady calm, inviting the viewer into a final reflection where all the documentary's themes converge. Here, in the stillness between eras, we confront the paradox that has guided every chapter. Truth may endure, but proof does not. Memory may persist in fragments, but meaning requires continuity. And certainty, no matter how carefully constructed, trembles before the immensity of deep time. The camera drifts downward into strata exposed by erosion, revealing layers of compressed worlds stacked like pages in a book, whose language we can decode only in fragments. Within these layers lie the remnants of oceans that vanished, forests that turned to coal, and creatures whose anatomies defy simple narrative. Somewhere within the absence between these layers, a civilization, if it ever existed, could have risen and been annihilated with such absolute completeness that not a single artifact survived to challenge the silence. This possibility does not rewrite scientific consensus. It redefines the scale of humility required to interpret a planet that does not preserve its own story. Against this backdrop of erasure, the documentary turns once again toward the moon, a world without atmosphere, a world without rain, a world where footprints endure with extraordinary clarity. The moon seems to promise permanence. Its surface holds the imprints of Apollo, untouched and undisturbed. Yet permanence on the moon is not permanence in the mind. Meaning depends on cultural lineage, on archives maintained, on technologies preserved, on societies capable of contextualizing the traces left behind. The lunar module may survive 1,000,000 years, but the interpretive framework explaining who placed it there, why, and how may not. The camera moves between the moon's unchanging plains and Earth's metamorphic crust, inviting the viewer to examine the contrast with renewed understanding. Evidence on the moon can endure, but the structures that validate and explain it belong to Earth, a world that destroys its past relentlessly. This juxtaposition reveals the paradox at the heart of the narrative. The question is not whether the moon landing happened. The question is why humanity assumes future civilizations will possess the uninterrupted cultural scaffolding required to interpret it correctly. Proof is a bridge that must be maintained. Without that bridge, even the most incontrovertible evidence becomes vulnerable to reinterpretation. A slow pan across a prehistoric shoreline now dissolves into the image of lunar regolith. Two worlds, bound by the same cosmic indifference, yet governed by different laws of memory. The prehistoric world shows us that civilizations, if they existed before the dinosaurs, could vanish so absolutely that not even myths survive them. This absence forces us to confront the fragility of our own narratives. If deep time erased entire epochs more vast than all of human history combined, then the expectation of eternal interpretive clarity becomes a form of unintended arrogance. The narration deepens into a philosophical register. The impossibility of definitive lunar proof does not stem from conspiracy or contradiction. It arises from the recognition that permanence is unattainable in a universe defined by transformation. Certainty is always provisional, always dependent on a chain of interpretation that can fracture without warning. The moon landing stands as a triumph of human will and ingenuity, but its long-term intelligibility is not guaranteed. Our footprints may endure, but the story tied to them is as vulnerable as any tale whispered across generations. The camera ascends one final time, rising above Earth and Moon together, suspending both worlds in the silent void. The narration speaks with a tone that blends reverence and contemplation. We stand within a brief moment in cosmic history, holding fragments of knowledge, striving to understand a past mostly erased and a future mostly unknowable. The civilizations that might have preceded us leave only questions. The civilizations that may follow us will face the same abyss of uncertainty. We are all temporary custodians of meaning, each age interpreting the echoes left behind by those who came before. The documentary closes with the final emotional reflection. Perhaps entire epochs existed beyond imagination, rising and falling before the first dinosaur walked. Perhaps our own stories will someday drift into obscurity, waiting to be rediscovered or reinterpreted by minds we cannot envision. In this tension between memory and silence, proof and doubt, permanence and dissolution, we encounter the true mystery of existence, not what is recorded, but what endures. If this journey moved you, share the video and subscribe to help us explore more forgotten epochs and the mysteries that shape our fragile understanding of time.